In the course of the year, there is a moment that easily passes unnoticed by modern consciousness, and yet it marks a decisive inner turning point in the relationship between the human soul and the cosmos. Candlemas, the 2nd of February, stands quietly between the great revelations of the Christmas Epiphany season and the powerful cosmic drama of Easter. In spiritual science, it is experienced not as a minor church feast, but as a threshold event, one that concerns the inward destiny of the human being far more than outer celebration. It is the moment when the light that revealed itself outwardly at Christmas and Epiphany begins to withdraw from the sense world and seeks its continuation within the human soul. During the Christmas period, the human being may still feel that the world itself speaks of spirit. The darkness of winter is filled with a promise. The stars, the rhythms of nature, and even the cold of the earth seem to carry a quiet assurance of meaning. Epiphany completes this outward revelation. What has entered the earthly realm becomes visible, perceptible, almost tangible for the soul that can still sense such things. Yet this phase cannot continue. If the human being were to remain dependent on an externally given spiritual light, inner freedom could never arise. Candlemas marks the moment when this external spiritual guidance recedes. Spiritual science describes this withdrawal not as a loss, but as a necessary act of cosmic education. Just as a teacher must one day step back so that the student may learn to stand independently, the spiritual world withdraws its immediate presence. At Candlemas, the human being is no longer carried by a surrounding spiritual warmth. The earth is still deep in winter, yet the promise of spring is already hidden within it. Likewise, the soul is no longer sustained by festive revelation, but is quietly asked whether it can bear the light within itself. In earlier epochs of humanity, this transition was experienced instinctively. The human soul lived more intimately within the rhythms of the earth. What we now experience inwardly as mood or intuition was once perceived as an objective reality. Candlemas was known as a time when the spiritual beings connected with light, growth, and life withdrew into deeper regions of the cosmos. The earth became more strongly surrendered to its own inner forces. Human beings sensed this as a moment of inward contraction, a call to gather themselves. In our time, this experience has largely faded from consciousness. Yet, its effects remain. Many people feel a subtle change around this time of year, a quiet seriousness, a turning inward, sometimes even a sense of heaviness or uncertainty. Spiritual science does not interpret this as psychological coincidence, but as the echo of a real spiritual event. The human being is no longer supported in the same way by cosmic forces and must begin to generate orientation from within. Candlemas thus belongs to the education of freedom. It is the first festival after Epiphany that no longer offers revelation, but instead poses a question. Can the human being carry light inwardly without outer confirmation? Can thinking, feeling, and willing become sources of warmth and direction when nature and cosmos remain silent? This question is not answered immediately. It resonates through the following weeks and only finds its full response at Easter when inner awakening meets cosmic resurrection. At this threshold, the human soul stands between memory and anticipation. The memory of the Christmas light still lives, but it can no longer be experienced directly. At the same time, the Easter forces are not yet active. The soul must endure a kind of spiritual sobriety, This sobriety is not meant to impoverish life, but to purify it. It creates the inner space in which genuine moral impulses can arise, impulses that are no longer borrowed from tradition or atmosphere, but born from individual responsibility. Candlemas therefore speaks quietly but decisively to the modern human being. It asks for attentiveness rather than devotion, for inner honesty rather than outer ritual. Where this question is heard, a new relationship to the year can begin to form. The year is no longer experienced merely as a sequence of seasons, but as a living conversation between the human soul and the spiritual world. A conversation that now pauses, waiting to hear whether the human being is ready to speak in freedom. When this inner demand of Candlemas is taken seriously, it becomes clear that it does not address the intellect alone, but the whole human constitution. The withdrawal of the outer spiritual light works most strongly upon the etheric and astral organization of the human being. Forces that previously flowed into the soul almost unconsciously now fall silent. And this silence is experienced inwardly as a kind of emptiness. Yet this emptiness is not a deficiency. It is a space in which something new may be born. Spiritual science points out that the human soul lives in constant relationship with the yearly rhythm of the earth. The earth itself breathes spiritually. In the time from autumn to midwinter, it inhales spiritual forces. From spring to summer, it exhales them again into the cosmos. Candlemas stands close to the deepest point of this inhalation. The earth has drawn spiritual forces into itself and now holds them in reserve. Externally, this is experienced as barrenness and cold. Inwardly, however, these forces are active in a concentrated form. At this time, the human being is no longer meant to look outward for spiritual nourishment. Instead, the soul is called to turn toward its own inner activity. Thinking becomes especially significant here, not abstract, mechanical thinking, but living thinking, thinking that can hold itself upright without immediate sensory or emotional support. Candlemas thus challenges the modern human being precisely at the point where contemporary consciousness is weakest. The capacity for quiet, sustained inner activity. In earlier epochs, this activity was supported by instinctive clairvoyance. The soul could still perceive spiritual realities without conscious effort. As this capacity faded, the human being gained freedom, but also lost orientation. Candlemas marks the point in the year when this loss is felt most sharply. It is a moment when inherited spiritual certainty no longer suffices. Yet conscious spiritual insight has not fully developed. The soul stands, as it were, between worlds. This condition is not accidental. It belongs to the task of our time. The human being must learn to carry spiritual reality inwardly in the form of moral intuition and conscious insight. Candlemas prepares this by confronting the soul with its own responsibility. The light that once came from the cosmos must now be rekindled through inner work. This work does not begin with exalted experiences, but with discipline, patience, and sincerity. The connection to the Christ impulse becomes especially subtle here. At Christmas, the Christ being enters the earthly realm. At Epiphany, this presence is revealed. At Candlemas, the Christ impulse withdraws from outer manifestation and seeks its continuation in the human heart. This does not happen automatically. It depends on whether the human being is willing to become an active bearer of spiritual light rather than a passive recipient. From this point onward, the Christ impulse works more inwardly, preparing the soul for the Easter experience. But Easter itself cannot be understood without Candlemas. Without the experience of inner darkness and silence, resurrection would remain an external symbol rather than an inner reality. Candlemas, therefore, has a preparatory character. It teaches endurance, endurance of not knowing, endurance of waiting, endurance of inner effort without immediate reward. This endurance has a moral dimension. When outer spiritual support is withdrawn, unconscious impulses gain strength. Habit, routine, and mechanical thinking easily take over. Candlemas calls a human being to resist this drift, not through force, but through attentiveness. It asks for an inner listening that can distinguish between what merely repeats itself and what genuinely seeks development. In this sense, Candlemas is deeply connected with conscience. Conscience does not speak loudly. It speaks when outer noise subsides. The quiet of this season creates the conditions under which the moral voice of the I can be heard more clearly. Yet this clarity often comes with discomfort. To hear conscience means to confront oneself without illusion. Candlemas thus has an austere quality. It does not console, it clarifies. At the same time, this austerity is filled with promise. The soul that accepts the challenge of Candlemas begins to develop a new relationship to time itself. The future is no longer awaited passively, it is prepared inwardly. What will later appear as insight, courage, or resolve has its germ in this quiet, often unnoticed season. The earth seems still asleep, but inwardly it is already preparing the forces of spring. So too in the human being, what appears outwardly as stagnation or pause may inwardly be a time of deep gestation. Candlemas teaches trust in this hidden process. It asks the human being to remain faithful to inner work even when nothing seems to respond from the outside. In this fidelity, a new form of spiritual perception slowly begins to form, one that no longer depends on inherited vision, but on conscious participation. In the next stage of this reflection, it becomes necessary to look more closely at how Candlemas relates to the transformation of thinking and how this transformation prepares the human being to experience Easter not merely as a festival of nature, but as an event of inner awakening and freedom. When we follow the impulse of Candlemas further, it becomes evident that its deepest task lies in the transformation of human thinking. The modern human being is accustomed to a form of thinking that mirrors the outer world, clear, sharp, and useful for practical purposes, yet inwardly cold and detached. This kind of thinking is perfectly suited to technical mastery of nature, but it is insufficient when the soul seeks orientation in the absence of outer spiritual guidance. Candlemas confronts the human being with this insufficiency. At this time of year, the soul can no longer lean on inherited religious imagery or seasonal uplift. What once came naturally must now be consciously achieved. Thinking is called upon to become inwardly active, to warm itself through moral engagement and truth-seeking. This is not yet imagination or clairvoyance, but a first step toward a thinking that is live, flexible, and inwardly responsible. Candlemas thus works quietly on the threshold between ordinary intellect and future spiritual cognition. In spiritual science, thinking is not regarded as a neutral instrument, but as a living activity that can either remain bound to the physical brain or gradually emancipate itself. During most of the year, thinking is supported and carried by the rhythms of outer life. At Candlemas, this support weakens. The soul experiences thinking more starkly, more nakedly. This can lead to doubt, restlessness, or even inner fatigue. Yet precisely this experience contains a hidden possibility, the possibility of learning to think without leaning on external stimulation. In earlier stages of human evolution, spiritual beings worked directly into human consciousness. Thinking was guided, inspired, and sustained from without. As these beings withdrew, human freedom emerged. Candlemas marks this withdrawal within the yearly rhythm. It is a reminder, renewed each year, that freedom is inseparable from solitude. The human being must endure moments when meaning is no longer given, but must be generated inwardly. This endurance is especially challenging in a culture that seeks constant stimulation and reassurance. Candlemas runs counter to this tendency. It does not offer answers. It sharpens questions. It does not soothe. It demands sincerity. In this sense, it is one of the most modern of festivals, even though it is among the least celebrated. It addresses precisely the crisis of modern consciousness, the loss of inner orientation in a world overflowing with information. Yet Candlemas does not abandon the human being to isolation. The spiritual world does not withdraw completely. It changes its mode of presence. Instead of acting upon the soul, it waits for the soul to act toward it. This reversal is subtle but decisive. Spiritual reality becomes accessible not through passive receptivity, but through active moral striving. The light that once illuminated from outside now waits to be kindled from within. This inner kindling is not emotional enthusiasm. It is a quiet resolve to remain truthful, to think carefully, to act responsibly, even when no outer authority confirms the rightness of one's path. Candlemas thus educates the will through thinking. It strengthens the capacity to stand inwardly upright, to carry meaning through one's own effort. This capacity is the foundation for all future spiritual development. The connection between Candlemas and Easter becomes clearer at this point. Easter is often experienced as a victory of life over death, of light over darkness. But this victory cannot be merely cosmic or natural if it is to have lasting significance for the human being. It must be prepared inwardly. Candlemas provides this preparation by asking whether the human being can remain faithful to inner light during a time when outer light has withdrawn. If this question is not taken up, Easter risks becoming a beautiful symbol without transformative power. If it is taken up, Easter can be experienced as something that answers a real inner struggle. Resurrection then appears not only in nature, but in consciousness itself. Thinking, having passed through the sobriety and solitude of Candlemas, becomes capable of receiving new life. Thus, Candlemas stands as a quiet guardian of spiritual seriousness. It prevents spiritual life from becoming sentimental or escapist. It insists that light must be earned inwardly before it can be truly received. In this insistence lies its enduring relevance. It speaks most strongly to those who are willing to endure uncertainty without abandoning the search for truth. In the final movement of this consideration, we will look at how Candlemas prepares the moral forces of the human being: conscience, responsibility, and freedom, and how these forces are called upon to become active participants in the unfolding of the yearly and human destiny. When Candlemas is approached from this deeper perspective, it reveals itself as a festival that works most strongly on the moral core of the human being. Its true sphere is not feeling or imagination, but conscience. At this point in the yearly rhythm, the human being is no longer upheld by inherited forms of meaning, nor inspired by visible signs of spiritual presence. What remains is the naked encounter with oneself. Candlemas asks whether the human being can act out of inner necessity rather than outer impulse. Conscience, in spiritual science, is not merely a social or psychological function. It is the echo within earthly consciousness of the human being's connection to the spiritual world. Yet this echo becomes audible only when outer noise subsides. The quietness of Candlemas creates precisely such a condition. The soul is no longer distracted by festive imagery or seasonal exuberance. What speaks now is subtle, often uncomfortable, but unmistakably personal. This is why Candlemas has such a sober character. It does not elevate, it tests. It does not promise, it asks. The human being is confronted with questions that cannot be answered by tradition, authority, or collective opinion. What do I stand for when no outer structure carries me? What do I continue to do when enthusiasm fades? What remains true when convenience and habit fall away? These questions are not theoretical. They live in the will. In this sense, Candlemas is deeply connected with freedom. Freedom does not begin with choice, it begins with responsibility. Only when the human being feels inwardly responsible for their thinking and acting does freedom become real. Candlemas prepares this by withdrawing supports that might otherwise mask inner dependency. The soul experiences a kind of spiritual solitude, not as abandonment, but as invitation. This invitation extends beyond the individual to humanity as a whole. Steiner often emphasized that our age is one in which spiritual guidance must increasingly be taken up consciously. What earlier epochs received through instinct or revelation must now be achieved through insight and moral effort. Candlemas reflects this historical situation in miniature. Each year, it reenacts, within the rhythm of time, the great transition of humanity from guided consciousness to self-guided consciousness. In this light, Candlemas also has a future-oriented quality. It prepares forces that will only fully unfold later in the year and even later in life. Decisions made inwardly during times of quiet often bear fruit when circumstances change. What is resolved at Candlemas may only become visible at Easter or even much later. Yet without this inner preparation, outer events remain superficial. The Christ impulse, understood spiritually, is inseparable from this process. At Candlemas, Christ is no longer experienced as a child in the world, nor as a cosmic revelation. He is encountered as a question within the human being. Can the I become a bearer of love, truth, and responsibility without external compulsion? This question does not demand immediate answers. It demands fidelity. Fidelity here does not mean rigidity. It means remaining inwardly present to one's moral striving even when it yields no immediate satisfaction. It means trusting that inner work has reality, even when it leaves no visible trace. Candlemas strengthens this trust by aligning the soul with the deep, hidden work of the earth itself, which at this time is entirely inward. Thus, Candlemas completes the winter mystery. Christmas brings birth, Epiphany brings revelation, and Candlemas brings inwardization. What has entered the world must now be taken up by the human being. Only then can the path toward Easter begin in earnest. Without Candlemas, the yearly rhythm would lack its moment of ethical seriousness. In a world that increasingly seeks certainty from external systems, Candlemas quietly reminds us that the most decisive forces arise when certainty is absent. It points to a form of spirituality that does not depend on signs, but on integrity. In doing so, it speaks not only to religious feeling, but to the future of human consciousness itself, a future in which light is no longer given, but freely chosen and responsibly carried.